On January 15th, 2026, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania pulled the fire alarm on the modern basketball economy. At a Philadelphia news conference last week, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced charges against 26 individuals in what the government describes as a sprawling bribery and point shaving conspiracy reaching across NCAA Division I men's basketball and the Chinese Basketball Association. Now, U.S. Attorney David Metcalf framed the stakes in language that felt bigger than a single scandal by basically saying that the stakes here are far higher than anything on a betting slip. And then he made the key point that every fan feels but rarely hears, stated so plainly and eloquently, actually, by federal prosecutors. The integrity of sports rests on fairness, honesty, and respect for the rules of competition. And that is what did not happen here, right? The lead charging document is a 70-page indictment in the United States v. Jalen Smith, Shane Hennon et al. I put the case number below. And it was also supported by additional other filings, informations, etc., that collectively cover the full defendant list. Now, this case is not merely a story of bad actors or kids making dumb choices. As alleged, it is a repeatable business model. It is a modern corruption system designed for legalized sports betting era, tailored to NCAA economics, and optimized for maximum profit with minimal visibility. Now, this podcast provides a comprehensive legal analysis of the indictment, the mechanics of the fix, and the chilling connection to a parallel NBA probe known as Operation Nothing But Bet. So, welcome to Point Shaving 2.0.
You're listening to the AAA Ball and Play podcast. Quick note, this is for education and entertainment. Nothing here is legal, tax, or financial advice, and nothing we say creates an athlete-agent relationship. Listening or contacting us does not make us your lawyers or your agents. For advice, talk to a qualified professional in your state.
According to the Department of Justice, the investigation uncovered a conspiracy involving more than 39 players from more than 17 NCAA Division I teams, with fixed and attempted fixes tied to more than 29 NCAA games. Now, the method here was bribe players to underperform so their team fails to cover the spread, often focusing on first half spreads because those were easier to hide. The payments were bribes usually ranging from $10,000 to $30,000 per game. And the profit strategy was to place large bets, including parlays, against the bribed players' teams. Now, the Department of Justice has identified the scheme as being led by fixers, including Jalen Smith, Mars Farley, Shane Hennon, Antonio Blakeney, Roderick Winkler, and Alberto Loreno. And that lineup matters because it explains how a conspiracy like this becomes scalable. You have gamblers who understand markets and timing. You have basketball insiders who have credibility and access. And you have actual players who can change outcomes without making it look like a throw. Now, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, the EDPA, has charged the defendants under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, specifically leveraging conspiracy to commit wire fraud and bribery in sports contests. Now, the indictment defines the operational core in really plain terms, right? The players altered their performance so that their team would not cover the spread. This is not the old school stereotype of losing the whole game on purpose, or what I think a lot of us think about when we think of throwing a game. This case is built around something far more surgical, which is why the first half spreads are the perfect alleged crime. First half manipulations is attractive for three reasons. One, lower visibility. Most fans don't remember first half lines if they even know that they exist. And like I said, and if you're a bettor, many casual bettors don't even realize that that market exists. Second reason is plausible deniability. Basketball is high variance. A few missed rotations, lazy closeouts, early foul trouble, rush shots, and everything can look like just basketball. The third reason is damage control for players. Players can fix a first half, then go nuclear in the second half and still preserve film, reputation, and draft hopes. So in other words, the fix can win the bet without looking like a fix. However, the brilliance and ultimately the criminality, right, of this scheme lies in its hierarchical structure and its proof of concept phase overseas. So basically, the CBA proof of concept, it's the Chinese test run, right? The government's theory begins overseas. Before infiltrating US colleges, the syndicate tested their methods in the Chinese Basketball Association. The indictment identifies Shane Sugar Shane Hennon and Marv's Vez Farley as the architects. They recruited former LSU standout and NBA player Antonio Blakeney, who played for the Bulls, who was then playing for the Zhengzhou Dragons during the 2022-2023 CBA season. So they recruited him to participate in point shaving and then to recruit teammates as well. The press release from the DOJ includes a detail that reads like a scene from a crime film, except for it's in a federal announcement. It's just, oh my goodness. A package containing nearly $200,000 in cash was left in Blakeney's storage unit in Florida. I mean, who leaves $200,000 in a storage unit? But it's like a bad after school movie. From a compliance and enforcement perspective, though, this really matters. This is the alleged moment the conspiracy shows it can generate enough cash flow to expand into the NCAA. I guess if you have $200,000 you can leave in a storage locker in Florida, you've got enough money to start bribing NCAA players. And that is exactly what the government says happened next. After profiting on the fixed CBA games, they turned their attention to fixing NCAA men's basketball games. Quote. So the precedent, Blakeney reportedly accepted that $200,000 in his storage thing to underperform. The result, in a March 6, 2023 game against Guangdong, Blakeney scored only 11 points, well below his 32-point average, ensuring a 31-point blowout loss for his team. Hennon was famously captured in encrypted text stating, "The only thing certain in life is death, taxes, and Chinese basketball." And maybe the federal government, right? So, following their success in China, the group turned to the US collegiate market. However, they didn't target the Power Four giants where athletes are already earning millions in name, image, and likeness deals. Instead, they weaponized what the DOJ calls the NIL bribery gap. The DOJ makes an unusually direct point about why NCAA players were vulnerable here. The fixers targeted players for whom bribes would meaningfully supplement or succeed legitimate NIL opportunities. And that sentence is the whole story here. This is not NIL caused crime. NIL did not invent gambling corruption, right? But NIL has created a massive and uneven compensation landscape. And where there's uneven money, there's predation. The post NIL reality prosecutors are describing, well, some athletes earn real money, right? Many athletes earn little to nothing, most of them. A bribe in the $10,000 to $30,000 range at a lower school can function like an instant salary, especially at programs without robust NIL ecosystems. And this is the exact type of economic vulnerability corruption rings look for: high access, low pay, and high pressure. Now, the target demographics, the fixers targeted programs in conferences like Southland, MAC, and the Atlantic 10. Schools named include DePaul, Tulane, Kennesaw State, LaSalle, and Coppin State. At these institutions, a $20,000 bribe represents life-changing money for athletes with few legitimate NIL prospects. Then they had a consultant cover. So to evade compliance officers, lead defendant Jalen Smith, who was a prominent Charlotte-based trainer, and Hennon posed as NIL consultants. Bribes were wired under the guise of marketing advances or consultation fees, providing a veneer of legitimacy to the bank transfers. Now, the indictment names 15 collegiate players as defendants, and they're all going to be arraigned next week, and we'll be covering that live. The strategy was precise: target the first half spread, as I've said before. So let's look at a couple of games. The first game we're going to look at is DePaul versus Georgetown from February 24th, 2024. Players agreed to tank the first half. DePaul failed to cover, and the fixers cashed out. Then there's McNeese State versus Nicholls State on February 17th, 2024, with bribes of about $32K. The $32,000 was offered to Nicholls players. However, the fix failed when McNeese won by 27, accidentally covering the spread. The notable defendants in that game were Jalen Terry at DePaul, Kevin Cross at Tulane, Bradley Izawiro at St. Louis, Simeon Cottle at Kennesaw State. Now, most players have been released as of right now on personal recognizant bonds, contingent on the surrender of passports and a total cessation of gambling activities. But a lot of that's going to change after arraignments next week. Now, the indictment unsealed on January 15th details a point shaving operation that targeted specific betting windows, as we said, most commonly the first half spread. While the full list of 29 games is sealed within the evidentiary exhibits, the following are the games that are showing up on the screen right now are the high profile games that were explicitly detailed in the charging documents. And you can see from the chart there, you've got the date, the matchup, the activity, the result of the fix, and whether they were successful or not. A lot of them were not successful, but these are all games that the DOJ apparently has proof of bribery. And of course, the other schools named in the indictment at the bottom of that chart there are Abilene Christian, Alabama State, East Carolina, Florida Atlantic, Fordham, Kent State, and St. Louis. Now, one of the most legally vivid sequences in the indictment involves the alleged DePaul fix. The indictment describes FaceTime and text communications where players allegedly agreed to influence the first half spread before that February 24, 2024 game against Georgetown. One of the key texts, because it captures both intent and coordination, reads, "Just talk to them. It's a lock." Right? The indictment alleges Georgetown was favored by roughly 2.5 points for the first half, and the conspirators placed wagers on Georgetown to cover. And then the first half unfolded in the exact pattern a clean point shave is built for. Georgetown was up 41-28 at half. The spread was covered. The fixers win bets. Okay. The indictment then alleges the second half looked normal, which is the entire point shaving 2.0 design, right? DePaul outscored Georgetown 48-36 in the second half. And prosecutors include the kind of message that makes juries lean forward and take note, right? One of the fixers, "I love Jalen Terry. He perfected this job." If proven, that is not bad defense. That is alleged performance manipulation with payment attached. Even more critically, the indictment alleges the bribe payout happened in cash shortly after the game. Jalen Smith, traveled to Chicago, and there's Instagram post of it, and delivered $40,000 in cash as bribe payments. One of the most underestimated details in modern sports corruption cases is that they do not succeed on math alone. They succeed on access. The indictment structure makes clear the government sees this scheme as built on trusted intermediaries, people who could get close enough to the players to make a bribe sound like an opportunity. That theme also appears in related charging documents describing how fixers could approach athletes because of their prominence and reputation in basketball circles. This matters because it connects sports law, recruiting culture, and criminal exposure in a way compliance programs often miss. The recruiting pipeline can double as a corruption pipeline when a fixer looks like a trainer, an AAU figure, a consultant, a scout adjacent insider. Then the athlete's threat detection system shuts off. This is not a moral judgment. That is how human beings work. And that's what happened here. Now, let's talk about the Kennesaw State example. Again, all of this is alleged, right? Another indictment sequence illustrates how fixers allegedly enforced quality control over a fix. In one alleged exchange tied to Kennesaw State, the organizer pushes for multiple FaceTime check-ins to prevent any deviation. There's quotes like "this money guaranteed" and "I'm gonna be at the game." That's not the language of casual gambling. It reads like operational discipline: verify, confirm, execute, pay. And prosecutors allege a cash payout in this case, again, immediately followed. Approximately $40,000 in cash was the text, said $40,000 in cash delivered. It's bribe payments. Then it gets really spicy, right? We have the Sugar Shane connection, Operation Nothing by Bet. I love the government's names. Okay. So perhaps the most explosive aspect of this case is its intersection with the NBA, though, through Shane Hennon. Hennon serves as the nexus between the collegiate scandal and the high profile NBA investigation unsealed in October 2025. So, as mentioned throughout the blog and throughout this podcast today and the fast breaks, Shane Hennon acted as the mastermind and technological liaison for these schemes. His activities represent a rare crossover where a single individual corrupted the CBA, the NBA, and the NCAA simultaneously. For illustrative purposes, here's a rough timeline of Hennon's alleged actions. So, December 2022 to March of 2023, Hennon allegedly establishes a network with NBA players, including Terry Rozier, to receive pre-public medical and injury data. He uses this hammer under prop bets. He uses this to hammer under prop bets, right? Then we have March 2023, the CBA. So working with Mars Fairley, Hennon successfully fixed two high-stakes Chinese league games via Antonio Blakeney. And Hennon text, that's where the only thing certain in life is death, taxes, and Chinese basketball, right? Then we go to December 2023 to April 2024, and we've got the NBA and Mafia Poker involved. Hennon allegedly provided cheating technology, altered shuffling machines, to high stake poker games in New York City and Miami, lures for which included Chauncey Billups. Then we have February 2024 to February 2025. That was the NCAA expansion. Leveraging his reputation as a trainer, Hennon utilized Jalen Smith and Antonio Blakeney to recruit cash-strapped NCAA players for the 29-game point shaving spree. October 23rd, 2025, he was arrested as part of Operation Nothing by Bet in Brooklyn. Charges included wire fraud and illegal gambling. We go to January 15th of this year, formally indicted in Philadelphia for the NCAA CBA corruption case. He's currently facing over 60 years in total potential federal prison time. Hennon is also a co-defendant in the case against NBA player Terry Rozier. On March 23rd, 2023, Rozier allegedly tipped off associates that he would fake an injury or exit early against the Pelicans. Hennon and others placed $200,000 on Rozier's unders, and he exited after just 9 minutes. Now, this is the DOJ labels this the midnight run. I just love it. Okay, so following the game, associate Lassiter allegedly collected cash and drove through the night to Terry's home, where surveillance cameras capture them counting the $200,000. All right, the investigation also touches on Operation Royal Flush. Don't you guys just love these names? Okay. Operation Royal Flush, implicating Portland Trail Blazers coach Chauncey Billups. Now, Billups allegedly functioned as a face card. A face card is a celebrity lure for high stakes, rigged poker games run by organized crime families. Okay. The games utilized rigged shuffling machines and x ray tables. Billups is accused of knowing the games were fixed and even losing on purpose to maintain the con. Now, Billups is also suspected of being co-conspirator number 8, who leaked that Portland starters would sit out a March 2023 game, facilitating a $100,000 wager before the news went public. So, to summarize, media reporting and EDNY filings publicly describe several separate federal prosecutions in 2025 involving illegal sports betting and insider wagering activity, rigged illegal poker games with face cards, including Coach Chauncey Billups, and reporting that those investigations were internally nicknamed, as I said, Operation Nothing by Bet and Operation Royal Flush. Now, one reason that matters here is the EDPA press release explicitly thanks EDNY for assistance, signaling multi-district coordination. The significance of this is that if the government proves its theory, the sports integrity threat is not just players gambling, it is repeat offender market makers moving between pro-betting ecosystems, underground gambling operations, and financially vulnerable NCAA environments. I mean, you really think about that, right? That is the industrialization part, which leads me to a deeper look at the federal charges, right? So the federal charges clearly show why this isn't just gambling. This case is built on a very intentional federal charging architecture. So we start with bribery and sporting contest. This statute prohibits schemes, quote, to influence by bribery any sporting contest, covering both amateur and professional ones. It is the cleanest sports integrity statute in the federal arsenal, and it carries a maximum of 5 years. But then you have the wire fraud plus conspiracy. Now, wire fraud is the engine that's driving the penalties here. It targets schemes to defraud using interstate wires, which is don't just think wires. Wires means text, calls, apps, online wagering. All right. The DOJ explains the elements in its wire fraud guidance, and I've linked to that below as well. Now, 1349 makes conspiracy punishable at the same level as the underlying offense. And the DOJ's press release spells out the maximum exposure. Wire fraud and conspiracy counts carry a maximum 20 years per count. From a defense standpoint, this is the headline, right? Sports bribery is the moral wrong. Wire fraud is the sentencing hammer. Now, one of the most important conceptual points for non lawyers is this. Even if a sports book eventually adjusts its odds, which they usually do, right? Even if a player eventually plays well, even if the team wins the game, the government's theory is that the scheme corrupts the integrity of the market, which it does, the moment the wager is placed on manipulated conditions. That is why these cases can be prosecuted as fraud, even if the bets didn't win. Sports books and other bettors are allegedly induced into taking the other side of a contest that has been secretly rigged. The indictment reveals a sophisticated, also and this is great. This is great. I love white collar crime, and this is a great part of this, right? The indictment reveals a sophisticated money laundering ecosystem designed to clean nearly $7.1 million in illicit gains. First, you have the shell companies. Jalen Smith and Hennon operated shell entities registered as sports marketing firms that allowed them to issue bribes labeled as endorsement advances. Then we've got smurfing, right? To avoid the $10,000 currency transaction report threshold, which, if you don't know what that is, a bank is required to report any lump sum deposit that's made of $10,000. So usually when you're trying to launder money, white collar criminals will keep any money that's deposited below that $10,000 threshold. It's the currency transaction report threshold. All right. And the group used straw bettors to place dozens of small wagers at physical sport books in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. And then we have the casino wash, right? Significant laundering occurred at Rivers Casino, Philadelphia. Fixers would buy into games with illicit cash, play briefly, cash out with a clean casino check to justify their wealth. Now, there's also crypto mixers. In the poker scheme, winnings were converted to Bitcoin and run through mixers before being deposited in the Cayman Islands. This is just, it's crazy, right? So now, as mentioned above, the defendants face a litany of federal charges. The most severe is wire fraud, which carries that maximum of 20 years in federal prison per count. So we have a lot of upcoming court dates, right? So the indictment was unsealed last week. On January 20th, this week, initial appearances for Jalen Smith, Shane Hennon, and Mars Fairley occurred. January 22nd, you have an extradition appearance, an appearance for Antonio Blakeney. Now, next week, January 26th through 28th, we have the staggered arraignment for the indicted NCAA players. Now, I anticipate the NCAA players will argue they were manipulated by older, legitimate authority figures like Smith and Hennon, who misrepresented the legality of the payments as NIL deals. However, for the fixers like Hennon, who have now been indicted in two separate federal conspiracies, the NBA and the NCAA, the path to a plea deal will likely require substantial cooperation against higher level organized crime figures, and I'm not sure that you're going to see that. So, in a case like this, the near-term legal landscape will typically include detention and bond litigation, discovery fights over phones, financials, betting logs, location data, motion practice, right, for severance of the trial, suppression, venue challenges, cooperation decisions, especially for the lower level participants. And this is going to become a cooperation case, right? Sports corruption conspiracies often break through text messages, payment evidence, and the fact that only a few people need to flip to explain the entire enterprise. And the indictment is structured with detailed game narratives that prosecutors have used to prove intent, agreement, and overt acts, and that they will use in court. Now, this case should get all of us to recognize a hard truth. Point shaving is now a systems problem. This case should force sports governance to confront that uncomfortable reality. Integrity cannot be protected with posters up in locker rooms and policies alone. In 2026, integrity protection is going to require education that matches how modern betting actually works, real compliance capacity monitoring, and escalation pathways, and aggressive enforcement against third-party access brokers. Because in the world the DOJ is describing, the fix did not begin with athletes, it began with professionals building a business model around athletes, specifically around athletes that were being shut out of the NIL boom, right? So, conclusion. Point shaving 2.0 is not just a scandal, it's also a warning. The federal government's filings portray U.S. v. Jalen Smith et al. As something bigger than a sports story, and it is. It is an enforcement message, a governance failure, and a preview of what integrity risk looks like in the post-NIL, post-legal betting world. And the warning is as blunt as the FBI's statement. There is nowhere to hide. The short-term gain will never be worth the long-term loss. If the allegations are proven, the lasting consequence will not just be prison exposure for the defendants. The lasting consequence is that everyone, fans, athletes, schools, regulators, must accept a new reality. The market has evolved and corruption evolved with it, and the law is now sprinting to catch up. U.S. v. Jalen Smith is a watershed moment for sports law. It exposes the fragility of the post-NIL collegiate landscape and demonstrates how easily the lines between professional gambling syndicates and teenage athletes can be blurred. And that's a really scary thing. We're talking about teenage athletes and gambling syndicates. We've got to do better. As the arraignments begin in Philadelphia, the sports world should be bracing for, and from what I've seen they are, for more names to drop. For continued updates on US v. Smith and Operation Nothing by Bet, subscribe to our legal alerts. Disclaimer, this article is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is formed by listening to this podcast or reading the blog. Now, remember, there is a full blog up on this episode, and the part 2 of this that goes into detail on the basketball players and their charges and what we should see next week in the arraignment will be up very soon. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
You're listening to the AAA Ball and Play podcast. Quick note, this is for education and entertainment. Nothing here is legal, tax, or financial advice, and nothing we say creates an athlete-agent relationship. Listening or contacting us does not make us your lawyers or your agents. For advice, talk to a qualified professional in your state.